Snow fell like silent accusations across the manicured lawns of Siddons Court. Inside the Elizabethan manor, the fire crackled with false cheer while 11 people pretended to celebrate Sir Archibald Christie's 60th birthday. At precisely 11 minutes past midnight, the lights flickered once, then steadied. When they brightened again, Sir Archibald sat bolt upright in his Louis XV chair, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a perfect circle of surprise. A thin line of foam traced his lower lip. The priceless jeweled box he always fondled lay open upon his lap, empty. Chapter 1. The House. That jewels-built snow fell in thick, deliberate flakes across the Cotswolds, each one seeming to hesitate before it touched the ancient stone of Siddons Court, as though even the weather understood that this was a house that preferred its secrets kept cold. The manor rose from the white fields like a dark ship frozen mid-voyage, its chimneys breathing pale smoke into a sky the color of tarnished pewter. Inside, 100 candles guttered in crystal sconces, and the scent of beeswax fought a losing battle against the sharper odors of brandy, Turkish cigarettes, and the particular metallic tang that always lingers when fear has entered a room uninvited. Hercule Poirot stood just within the entrance of the great hall, removing his gloves one finger at a time with the meticulous care of a man who believes that disorder in small things invites catastrophe in great ones. His patent leather shoes gleamed like black mirrors, his mustache, waxed to symmetrical perfection, bristled with disapproval at the draught that sneaked beneath the oak door. He had accepted the invitation only because Lady Siddons had promised him an omelette fiends herbe, prepared by a chef lately of the Ritz, and Poirot, though he would never admit it aloud, was a man whose principles could occasionally be bribed with butter and tarragon. Captain Hastings, pink-cheeked and breathless, clattered in behind him, shaking snow from his motoring coat like a large, enthusiastic dog. "I say, Poirot, beastly night for a drive. Nearly went into a ditch twice. But jolly exciting, what? Birthday party for some old collector chap. Jewels and all that." "Jewels," Poirot repeated softly, tasting the word as though it were a dubious wine. "Always jewels. They bring light into a room, Hastings, and darkness into the soul." Before Hastings could frame a suitably baffled reply, a scream, high, theatrical, and entirely genuine, ripped through the house. It came from the library, followed by the crash of a chair overturned and the unmistakable thud of a body striking the Turkey carpet. Poirot moved with surprising swiftness for one so compact. He crossed the hall in a dozen precise steps, pushed open the double doors, and paused upon the threshold as though framing himself for an unseen artist. The scene within was one that would remain etched upon his memory with the clarity of a miniature painted on ivory. Sir Archibald Christie sat upright in a crimson-upholstered chair beside the fire, his posture impossibly rigid for a man who was unmistakably dead. His eyes bulged, his lips were parted in a perfect circle of astonishment. A thin ribbon of foam, delicate as spun sugar, traced the corner of his mouth. Upon his lap lay open a tiny enameled box no larger than a pocket watch, its lid worked in lapis lazuli and gold, a diamond-eyed serpent coiled around the rim. The interior, which should have contained a miniature surprise, perhaps a mechanical bird or a portrait, was empty. One of Sir Archibald's manicured hands still clutched the box. The other was frozen midway to his throat, as though he had attempted too late to tear away an invisible noose. Around him, the birthday guests formed a tableau of shock. Lady Lavinia Siddons, the hostess, stood with one black-gloved hand pressed to her throat, her diamonds flashing like panic signals. Dr. Felix Hawthorne, young, handsome, and already reaching for a pulse that would never return, knelt beside the chair. Roderick Blaine, Sir Archibald's younger brother, clutched a brandy balloon so tightly that the crystal threatened to shatter. Mrs. Greer, the maid, had dropped her silver tray, Tiny almond biscuits lay scattered across the carpet like pale corpses. And in the shadows by the bookcases, Miss Felicity Blaine, secretary, grandniece, and rumor-whispered heiress presumptive, stood perfectly still, her small hands clasped before her as though in prayer, her face so bloodless that the freckles across her nose stood out like flecks of rust. Inspector Japp, who by some administrative miracle happened to be visiting a cousin in the county, pushed through the French windows at that moment, bringing with him a gust of snow and Scotland Yard authority. "What the devil's going on here?" he barked, then caught sight of Poirot and groaned. "Oh, Lord, you would be here." "Naturellement," Poirot replied, stepping fully into the room. "When there is a crime of elegance, Hercule Poirot is never far away." He approached the body with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. The firelight danced across the dead man's signet ring, across the diamond serpent on the fatal box. Poirot bent close, his nostrils flaring delicately. No scent of cyanides, bitter almonds, yet something acrid lingered beneath the wood smoke. He lifted the box with a silk handkerchief, careful not to touch the rim, and studied the exquisite enameling. Russian influence, but not Fabergé, later more decadent. The serpent's eyes were chips of emerald, its tongue a needle-thin ruby. Beautiful, and Poirot suspected lethal. "Curare," he murmured. "From the jungles of the Amazon, it acts swiftly upon the motor nerves. The victim suffocates while the mind remains cruelly clear. Mon Dieu, what a death! Paralyzed, conscious, unable to cry out." Hastings shuddered. "You mean he knew?" "He knew everything until the last moment." Poirot closed the lid with a soft click. "Observe, my friend, the box is empty. Whatever it contained, poison, perhaps a dart, has been removed. Or perhaps the poison was upon the rim itself, transferred to the fingers, then to the lips. Sir Archibald was known to caress his treasures. A fatal indulgence." Lady Siddons found her voice at last. "This is outrageous. Archibald was in perfect health. He ate nothing, drank nothing that the rest of us did not share. It must have been his heart." Dr. Hawthorne rose slowly, brushing biscuit crumbs from his trousers. "Lady Siddons is correct. Sir Archibald suffered from angina. Excitement, perhaps." "Non." Poirot's voice cut like a scalpel. "Angina does not produce foam at the lips. Angina does not leave the eyes bulging in such exquisite terror. Someone in this room has committed a murder most artistic." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Roderick Blaine drained his brandy in a single gulp. "Steady on, little foreigner. My brother had enemies, yes, but we're not savages." "Enemies?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Tell me of these enemies, monsieur." Roderick opened his mouth, closed it again, and reached for the decanter. Felicity Blaine stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "Uncle Archibald believed someone was substituting forgeries for pieces in his collection. He spoke of it only yesterday. He was agitated." "Agitated enough to change his will?" Poirot asked softly. Felicity's eyes flickered. "I couldn't say." Lady Siddons gave a brittle laugh. "Really, Miss Blaine, we all know you were to benefit handsomely if Archibald signed that new document. Perhaps he decided against it at the last moment." Color returned to Felicity's cheeks in a rush. "How dare you! I loved my uncle." "Loved him enough to catalog every piece in his collection," Dr. Hawthorne said quietly. "Every flaw, every hallmark, intimate knowledge, one might say." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them in. Poirot raised a hand for silence. "Enough. Inspector Japp will wish to question each of you separately. For myself, I require only 3 things: a quiet room, a cup of tisane, chamomile not too strong, and the complete inventory of Sir Archibald's jeweled boxes." One of them, mes amis, has become an instrument of murder, and one of you has become a murderer." He turned to the fireplace where the flames leapt and hissed like guilty consciences. Behind him, the guests shifted and whispered, each measuring the distance between innocence and guilt. The storm had closed the roads. The telephone wires were down. They were trapped together in a house filled with priceless treasures, and now, one priceless secret. Somewhere in the rafters, a clock struck midnight. 12 slow, deliberate chimes, as though time itself were counting, down to revelation. Poirot smiled without warmth. The game, as he liked to say, had begun. Chapter 2. The Inventory of Desire. Morning arrived sullen and reluctant, a thin gray light filtering through the frost flowers that had bloomed overnight on every window of Siddons Court, turning the great house into a crystal prison where each pane reflected a slightly distorted version of the tragedy within. The snow had ceased, but the wind still prowled the eaves like a restless animal, rattling the leaded casements and sending small avalanches from the gables whenever it found purchase. Breakfast had been a silent affair. The kippers congealed untouched, the coffee grew cold in Sèvres cups, and even the toast seemed to have absorbed the general atmosphere of dread, curling at the edges as though trying to escape the table. Poirot, who had risen at 6 and spent the intervening hours in the muniment room poring over ledgers with the devotion of a monk illuminating a manuscript, now stood in the long gallery where Sir Archibald's collection was displayed beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with faded gods and goddesses who appeared this morning to be looking down in disapproval at the affairs of mortals. The gallery smelled of Russian leather, violet caoutchouc, and something faintly medicinal that clung to the velvet-lined cases. 109 jeweled boxes rested upon individual plinths of ebony and ormolu, each illuminated by its own electric bulb concealed behind crimson silk so that rubies bled, sapphires bruised the air, and emeralds gave off a cold, venomous glow. Poirot walked the length of the room slowly, hands clasped behind his back, pausing before every piece as though greeting old acquaintances whose characters he already suspected. Hastings trailed behind, notebook in hand, trying valiantly to match his friend's gravity and failing with every creak of the frozen floorboards. Inspector Japp, still pale from the previous night's narrow escape, he had merely brushed the rim of the serpent box and suffered only a racing heart, brought up the rear muttering about warrants and post-mortems and the impossibility of keeping a houseful of toffs from tampering with evidence. At the far end, directly beneath a portrait of Sir Archibald in the crimson robes of a Knight of the Garter, stood an empty plinth draped in black velvet like a miniature catafalque. It was here that the fatal serpent box had lived until yesterday evening, when Sir Archibald had carried it away in his waistcoat pocket to show a visiting Russian princeling who had never arrived, detained, it was said, by the storm. Poirot halted before the void and allowed the silence to thicken until it became almost tangible, a heavy brocade that muffled even the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel. Then he spoke softly, yet every person assembled in the doorway heard him with perfect clarity. "Observe, mes amis, the psychology of the collector. Sir Archibald did not merely own these boxes. He possessed them as a miser possesses gold, as a lover possesses the image of his beloved. Each morning he walked this gallery and caressed them one by one like a rosary of desire. To remove even a single piece from its place was, for him, an act of sacrilege. Yet last night he himself removed the serpent box. Why? Felicity Blaine, who had been standing a little apart from the others, her dove-gray frock making her look more child than woman, answered before anyone else could frame a reply. Uncle often carried one or another of the smaller pieces when he wished to study them more closely. The serpent box was a particular favorite. He said it contained his most precious secret. Her voice was steady, almost colorless. But Poirot noted the way her left hand worried at the jet mourning brooch pinned at her throat, turning it round and round until the pin threatened to prick her fingers. He made a small, non-committal sound and moved on, pausing before a nephrite box surmounted by a tiny golden elephant whose howdah opened to reveal a mechanical orchestra no larger than a thumbnail. "And this one, mademoiselle, did he also carry this one in his pocket?" "Sometimes," she said, then added too quickly, "when he was in a whimsical mood." Roderick Blaine gave a snort that managed to convey both grief and contempt in equal measure. Whimsical. My brother was about as whimsical as a banker foreclosing on an orphanage. He carried that damned serpent because he believed someone in this house was swapping his treasures for forgeries, kept muttering about it for weeks, even accused me once, the old fool. He took a pull from a silver hip flask that had appeared as if by magic and wiped his mouth with the back of a hand that trembled only slightly. Dr. Hawthorne, who had been studying the empty plinth with professional detachment, now turned. Sir Archibald did indeed suffer from nervous anxiety. I prescribed bromide. He complained that certain pieces no longer gave him pleasure, that the colors were wrong, the weight not what it had been. I put it down to incipient cataracts and the strain of overwork. "Overwork," Poirot echoed, savoring the word. "Yes, the cataloguing of 109 masterpieces, the authentication, the endless correspondence with dealers in Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg. No, Leningrad now, pardon. It is a labor that might drive a lesser man to distraction. And you, mademoiselle," he wheeled suddenly toward Felicity. "You assisted him in this labor, is it not so? Your handwriting I recognize in the ledger. Such elegant copperplate, such precision. You weighed each piece, measured it, recorded the hallmarks. You knew them more intimately than Sir Archibald himself knew them in his final months." Felicity lifted her chin. "I was his secretary. It was my duty." "Duty," Poirot repeated, rolling the word on his tongue like a sip of Calvados. "A noble motive. Yet duty poorly rewarded, perhaps. The new will, the one that was to be signed this very weekend, rumor says it left the bulk of the collection to the nation with only a modest annuity for blood relations." Lady Siddons gave a small, satisfied hiss. "Modest. The man was worth $750,000, and he proposed to leave his own flesh and blood scraping along on $2,000 a year while these baubles went to some ghastly museum where school children would breathe on them." Roderick laughed, a cracked sound. "Don't pretend virtue, Lavinia. You've been trying to get your claws into the collection for years. Remember the scene at Christie's when Archibald outbid you for the Romanov music box? You didn't speak to him for a 12-month. Lady Siddons's eyes flashed beneath her veil. "At least I never stole from him, unlike certain others whose names I could mention." Mrs. Greer, who had been hovering near the door in case anyone required tea no one wanted, let out a small strangled sound and dropped a curtsy that was half terror, half defiance. "I never took nothing but that one little brooch, m'lady, and I give it back, didn't I?" Poirot raised a hand, and the bickering ceased as suddenly as if he had turned off a tap. He returned to the empty plinth and laid one kid-gloved finger upon the black velvet, leaving a perfect oval print. "Enough. We stray from the point. The point, mes amis, is this. At some moment yesterday evening, someone in this house coated the rim of the serpent box with curare, enough to kill, yet not enough to be visible to the naked eye. Sir Archibald, in the habit of caressing his treasures, transferred the poison to his fingers, then to his lips, perhaps while raising a glass in a birthday toast. He died within minutes, fully aware, unable to call for help. The box was then removed from his lap, by the murderer almost certainly, and hidden. Yet this morning a telegram arrives." He produced the flimsy yellow paper from his waistcoat pocket and held it up so all could see. "Sent from the village post office at 7 o'clock. The serpent box has been posted to me, Hercule Poirot at Whitehaven Mansions, with no message, no return address. Someone wishes me to believe the murderer has fled. Someone wishes me to look outward when the evil is here among us, breathing the same frozen air. He folded the telegram with finicking care and replaced it. Therefore we shall remain here, all of us, until the little gray cells have done their work. The roads are impassable, the telephones are dead, and outside the snow lies deep and crisp and even. We are sealed together like the mechanical figures inside these boxes, exquisite, expensive, and waiting for someone to turn the key. As if in answer, the ormolu clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour, its notes thin and cold. In the hush that followed, Poirot smiled his small, cat-like smile and began very gently to hum the aria from Tosca, in which Scarpia contemplates the many ways a man may be made to suffer. The sound floated beneath the painted gods, curled around the jeweled boxes, and settled at last upon the empty plinth like a promise or a threat. Chapter 3. The Scream in the Gallery. The afternoon dragged itself across the sky like a wounded thing, the light never quite achieving daylight, only a bruised and sulky luminescence that turned every face the color of old parchment and made the snow outside appear faintly blue, as though the house had been sunk beneath a frozen sea. Lunch had been abandoned after the soup. No one possessed the stomach for sole meunière when murder sat at the table wearing an invisible fourth-place card. And the inhabitants of Siddons Court scattered to their separate miseries. Lady Siddons to her boudoir with sal volatile and veiled recriminations. Roderick to the billiard room with a fresh bottle of Armagnac that would not last the hour. Dr. Hawthorne to the dispensary to prepare unnecessary sedatives. Mrs. Greer to the still room where she wept noisily over the silver polish, and Felicity Blaine nowhere at all, vanished so completely that even the housemaids swore they had not seen her pass along any corridor. Poirot alone remained purposeful. He had requisitioned the winter garden, an iron and glass fantasia of palms and wicker chairs that smelled perpetually of damp earth and Russian leather. And there he sat, motionless as a porcelain mandarin staring at the serpent box sealed inside a crystal bell jar, while Hastings fidgeted and the frost etched ever more intricate ferns upon the panes. At 23 minutes past 3, the scream came, not the theatrical gasp of the previous night, but something raw, stripped of manners and breeding, a sound torn from the throat of someone who has looked into an abyss and recognized her own reflection. It issued from the long gallery, ricocheted along the minstrel corridor, and shattered the brittle quiet of the house like a stone hurled through a stained glass window. Poirot was already moving, his small feet skimming the parquet with the silent urgency of a cat, Hastings lumbering behind, Jap clattering up the servants' stair with 2 constables at his heels like hounds released to the hunt. They found Felicity Blaine on her knees before the empty plinth, her dove-gray frock pooled around her like spilled milk, one hand outstretched toward the serpent box that now rested exactly where it had been before the murder, lid closed, diamond eyes glittering with malevolent satisfaction. The black velvet drape lay discarded on the floor, and upon the lid of the box someone had scratched, with a diamond or a hat pin, the grooves were cruelly deep, a single word: traitress. Felicity's breath came in shallow animal pants. Her pupils were enormous, swallowing the pale irises until only a rim of winter sea green remained. When Poirot knelt beside her, she flinched as though he carried the plague. "It was not here," she whispered. "Not an hour ago, I swear it. I came to think, and it was waiting for me. It knows." Her voice cracked on the last word, a child's voice suddenly stripped of its careful secretarial veneer. Jap, ever practical, reached for the box. Poirot's hand shot out like a striking adder. "Imbecile! Touch the rim and you will join Sir Archibald sooner than you wish." Jap froze, palm hovering a fraction above the enamel. Poirot produced a pair of surgical forceps from his pocket. He traveled, he had once confided to Hastings, prepared for every emergency except perhaps an honest man, and with infinite care lifted the box into a second, larger bell jar that a footman was sent running to fetch. Only then did he permit himself to examine the accusing word more closely. The scratches were fresh. Tiny curls of lapis lazuli dust still clung to the grooves like poisonous pollen. Hastings found his voice. But who could have returned it? We've had a man posted at every door since dawn. Japp scowled and dispatched constables to search the chimneys, the dumb waiters, the priest's hole behind the library paneling, any aperture large enough to admit a determined murderer or a small and desperate woman. They found nothing but mouse droppings and centuries of dust. Poirot opened the box with the forceps. Inside, nestled on a bed of now crumpled crimson silk, lay a single object. A slender glass dart no longer than a sewing needle, its tip darkened with a viscous residue that caught the light like old blood, and beneath it a folded scrap of paper in Sir Archibald's unmistakable spidery hand. Poirot unfolded it with the reverence of a cardinal revealing a relic. The ink was brown, almost certainly written with a fountain pen that had begun to corrode its own nib. To whichever of my loving family discovers this, know that I have been betrayed by blood closer than brotherhood. The serpent guards the truth. Guard yourselves. The note was signed with Sir Archibald's flourish and dated the very day of his death. Felicity made a small wounded sound and pressed both hands to her mouth as though to cage further screams. Dr. Hawthorne arrived at a run, medical bag swinging, took one look at the dart and went the color of tallow. "Curare," he said hoarsely. "Enough on that point to kill a dozen men, where in God's name?" "In the Amazon originally," Poirot interrupted, "and more recently in the possession of someone who understands both poisons and psychology. Observe, the murderer returns the weapon to the scene complete with accusation and damning note, knowing we will all leap to the obvious conclusion that Miss Blaine, named indirectly as traitress, has tried to destroy evidence and been foiled. Yet the note is in Sir Archibald's hand, written before his death. Therefore, either the murderer is a forger of genius or—" He allowed the silence to finish the sentence for him. Lady Siddons, who had appeared in the doorway swathed in black lace like a particularly vindictive spider, gave a soft, satisfied laugh. "Or the girl herself placed it there to deflect suspicion. Really, Monsieur Poirot, it is almost too transparent." Felicity surged to her feet, trembling with fury or terror. It was impossible to distinguish. "I did not kill him. I found it exactly as you see it." Poirot regarded her steadily, his green eyes luminous in the failing light. "Then someone wishes us very much to believe that you did, mademoiselle. Someone who knows this house intimately. Every secret passage, every loose floorboard. Someone who can come and go like a ghost. Someone who understands that fear is more powerful than any lock." He turned to Japp. "From this moment, the long gallery is sealed. No one enters without my permission on pain of arrest. The box and its contents go to your toxicologist tonight by sledge if necessary. And Miss Blaine—" He paused almost gently. "Miss Blaine will remain under observation. Not, you understand, as a prisoner, yet, but as a young woman who has been made the centerpiece of a very cruel charade." Outside, the short day collapsed into darkness with indecent haste. Lamps were lit, but their glow seemed thin, as though the house itself were rationing light against the coming night. In the winter garden, the palms rustled, though there was no wind, and somewhere far above, in the attics where the old nursery had been locked since the war, a child's rocking horse began to rock, though no child had crossed its threshold in 20 years. Poirot heard it. He heard everything, and the little gray cells stirred like cats waking to the scent of blood. The murderer had returned the serpent to its lair, but the serpent, Poirot reflected with a wintry smile, had not yet struck its final victim. Chapter 4. The matter of the forgery night pressed its black face against every window of Siddons Court until the house seemed no more than a single candle guttering inside a coffin of snow, and the silence that followed dinner was of the sort that makes the ears ring. A silence broken only by the occasional crack of contracting ice in the water pipes, and the slow, deliberate tread of constables who had been posted at every door yet still managed to sound as though they were guarding a tomb. Poirot had dismissed the household at 10 o'clock with the mildness of a cardinal dismissing penitents, requesting only that they retire to their rooms and refrain from locking their doors, a request that fell upon them like a sentence of death. He himself remained in the long gallery, seated in a tall Elizabethan chair beneath the disapproving gaze of Sir Archibald's painted ancestor. The serpent box now locked inside a small steel safe that Japp had fetched from the gun-room and which Poirot had personally secured with a padlock no larger than a sixpence, yet he assured them quite impossible to pick without the key that now reposed in his left waistcoat pocket alongside a small pearl-handled revolver. He had never yet fired in anger. At 1:30, the house lights were extinguished by the simple expedient of throwing the main switch in the cellar, Poirot's orders delivered with apologetic courtesy. Only the gallery remained illuminated by a single green-shaded banker's lamp that cast a pool of submarine light across the empty plinths and turned every jewel into a drowned eye watching from the ocean floor. Hastings, who had been dozing on a root chair with his overcoat pulled up to his chin, woke with a start when Poirot laid a gloved hand upon his shoulder. "It is time, mon ami. The little play begins." From the shadows at the far end of the gallery stepped 3 constables in stocking feet, and behind them Inspector Japp, rubbing circulation back into wrists that still bore faint bruises from the curare's brief kiss. They had been waiting since midnight in the disused priest's hole, breathing through their sleeves to muffle the sound, and their faces were the color of tallow candles left too near the flame. Poirot raised one finger to his lips, then moved to the steel safe, unlocked it with a soft snick that sounded shockingly loud in the waiting dark, and removed the serpent box wrapped in a square of black velvet. He placed it upon the empty plinth exactly as it had appeared that afternoon, the scratched word "traitress" turned toward the door. Then he extinguished the banker's lamp. The gallery plunged into absolute blackness, the sort of darkness that has weight and temperature, and in that darkness Poirot whispered, "Now we become the bait, and the murderer becomes the fish." Minutes stretched like hours. Somewhere a grandfather clock cleared its throat and struck 2. Hastings felt his heart beating against his ribs as though trying to escape. Then came the faintest of sounds, not a footstep, but the whisper of silk against silk, the brush of a sleeve against paneling, followed by the softest intake of breath, almost a sigh of recognition. A match flared, sudden and sulphurous, revealing for one frozen instant the figure of Felicity Blaine standing before the plinth, her face lit from below like a medieval saint in torment, one hand already reaching for the serpent box. Behind her, in the deeper shadows, another figure moved, taller, male, and the match died as quickly as it had lived, plunging them all back into blindness. Pandemonium followed, but it was pandemonium choreographed by Poirot. The lights blazed on, electric, merciless, revealing not only Felicity but Dr. Felix Hawthorne half-crouched behind her, a hypodermic syringe glinting in his right hand, its needle already wet with what would later prove to be a massive dose of curare. At the same moment, Roderick Blaine lurched from the concealment of a tapestry that had hidden a small service door, brandy flask in one hand and a miniature revolver in the other, his face slack with astonishment and something that might have been triumph. Lady Siddons appeared on the minstrel gallery above, black lace fluttering like raven wings, a silver-plated pistol steady in her gloved hand. Even Mrs. Greer was there, emerging from behind a suit of armor, clutching a silver candlestick she had clearly intended to use as a bludgeon. They had all come, drawn by the same irresistible compulsion, like planets pulled into fatal conjunction around a dark sun. For one impossible second, nobody moved. Then every weapon leveled at someone else, and the gallery became a tableau of mutual destruction waiting only for a spark. Poirot's voice cut through the tension like a bell through fog. "I say, you will all lower your weapons or Inspector Japp's men will be obliged to shoot every one of you, which would be untidy and, more importantly, unnecessary. The serpent has done its work." Slowly, incredulously, hands opened, metal clattered on oak. Felicity began to weep without sound, tears sliding down cheeks that had no more color to lose. Dr. Hawthorne let the syringe fall. It shattered into 1,000 bright needles of glass. Only Poirot moved, stepping forward to retrieve the serpent box and hold it aloft so that the light fractured across its enameled surface. "You see," he said conversationally, as though addressing a lecture hall rather than 5 would-be murderers. "The perfect crime is never perfect because the criminal cannot resist returning to the scene. But tonight 5 criminals returned, which is greedy even by the standards of avarice." Sir Archibald discovered forgeries, superb forgeries in his collection. Over 2 years, 37 pieces were replaced with copies so flawless that only a master enameler could have achieved them. The originals were sold through discreet channels in Geneva and Vienna. The proceeds, nearly £250,000, vanished into numbered accounts. The forger needed time to complete the substitutions before the new will was signed, bequeathing everything to the nation. Sir Archibald had to die. He turned to Felicity, and his voice softened by the merest degree. "You, mademoiselle, were the artist. Your skill with enamels was inherited, perhaps from the Russian grandmother Sir Archibald never acknowledged in public. You coated the rim of the serpent box with curare obtained by Dr. Hawthorne, who believed he was assisting a love affair, not a murder. You watched your uncle die, removed the box, posted it to me to create confusion, then returned it this afternoon with the scratched accusation and your uncle's genuine note, removed from his private desk, in order to cast suspicion upon yourself, knowing that English justice hesitates to condemn a woman who appears to be framing herself. A bold strategy, but flawed." Felicity's knees gave way. 2 constables caught her before she struck the floor. Dr. Hawthorne made a sound like a man choking on his own heartbeat. Roderick laughed, one sharp, broken bark, and let the revolver fall from nerveless fingers. Lady Siddons alone retained her composure, though the hand that had held the pistol now trembled as though with ague. Poirot continued remorselessly. "Mr. Blaine intended to shoot whoever appeared tonight, hoping to eliminate a rival thief. Lady Siddons planned the same with rather better aim. Mrs. Greer merely wished to brain the person she believed had implicated her in the original brooch theft. And Dr. Hawthorne, poor Dr. Hawthorne, came to silence Miss Blaine before she could confess and drag him down with her. 5 murderers, 1 murder, and all of you dancing to the tune played by a dead man's jeweled serpent." He closed the lid of the box with a small final click. "The collection will go to the nation after all, minus 37 pieces that will, I suspect, never be recovered. Miss Blaine will hang unless, as I rather think, she chooses the more discreet exit of poison in her cell. The rest of you will live with the knowledge that you came within a heartbeat of killing innocent people for treasures that were already lost. A salutary lesson, n'est-ce pas?" Dawn was still hours away, but already the wind had dropped, and the snow had begun to settle into the stillness that comes before a thaw. In the long gallery, the jeweled boxes gleamed coldly under the electric lights, each one guarding its tiny mechanical secret, each one waiting for a hand that would never again caress it. Poirot replaced the serpent box in its safe, turned the key and slipped it back into his waistcoat pocket beside the little revolver that had remained, after all, unfired. Outside, the first pale blade of true daylight slid between the curtains and fell across the empty plinth like the stroke of a scalpel, severing night from morning, guilt from punishment, and the living from the dead. Chapter 5. The true treasure dawn came slowly, reluctantly, the color of watered blood, as though the sky itself were ashamed to look upon Siddons Court after the revelations of the night. And the snow, which had fallen so thickly for 3 days, now lay exhausted and soiled, its pristine surface broken by the black tracks of constables' boots and the deeper dragging scars where Felicity Blaine had been led away, barefoot in the end because she had kicked off her slippers in a final childish gesture of refusal, leaving small crimson prints that froze almost as quickly as they were made. The house exhaled. Doors that had been sealed for 72 hours stood open to the raw air, and servants moved like ghosts among the furniture shrouded in dust sheets, carrying out tea trays no one had asked for and would never drink. In the long gallery, the jeweled boxes had been removed to the steel safe in the gun room, all except one. The serpent box rested alone upon its plinth, lid open, empty, waiting for the official photographer from Scotland Yard, who would record it for evidence before it, too, was locked away forever. Poirot stood before the plinth in his camel hair overcoat and gray suede gloves, the morning light catching the silver threads at his temples and making him look for once almost mortal. Hastings hovered at his elbow, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and the particular misery of watching a young woman he had privately considered rather pretty being taken off in manacles. Inspector Japp had departed an hour earlier with his prisoners, Felicity silent now, all tears spent, Dr. Hawthorne talking incessantly in a bright, brittle voice about appeals and insanity pleas, the others merely stunned, as though someone had struck them across the face with a cold fish. The echo of motor engines had faded down the drive, swallowed by the snow-muffled woods, and the house felt suddenly too large, its silence ringing like a cathedral after the congregation has gone. Poirot lifted the serpent box with the same forceps he had used the previous night, turning it so the light slid across the lapis lazuli scales. "Regard, Hastings," he said quietly. "Such beauty dedicated to such ugliness. A box made to delight the eye becomes an instrument of murder, and a father's last gift to his child becomes the means of her destruction. There is a lesson here, but I confess I am too weary to phrase it elegantly." He was about to replace the box when his thumb brushed the inner rim. Something shifted, the faintest click, no louder than a snowflake landing. A false bottom, cunningly sprung, rose a millimeter and settled again. Poirot's eyes widened. For the first time in 3 days, the little gray cells sparked with something like delight. With infinite care, he pressed the concealed catch a second time. The crimson silk lining lifted entirely, revealing a second compartment no deeper than a wafer, and within it lay a miniature oval portrait on ivory, no larger than a sixpence, framed in seed pearls. A young woman with soft brown hair and eyes the exact winter sea green of Felicity Blaine, holding an infant wrapped in christening lace. On the reverse, in faded sepia ink, Sir Archibald had written, "To my beloved daughter, born 12th of March 1910, stolen from me by cruel circumstance. If you read this, know that every jewel in my collection was bought to bring me closer to the day I might place them at your feet. Your father, who never ceased to love you. A.C." Beneath the portrait lay a single lock of baby hair tied with faded blue ribbon. Hastings felt his throat close. "Good Lord, Poirot." She was his daughter. His natural daughter, Poirot corrected gently. Born to a Russian émigré, he could not marry without forfeiting his place in society. He placed the child with distant cousins, paid for her upbringing, brought her back as his secretary when she was 18, planning one day to acknowledge her openly. The new will was not charity, Hastings. It was restitution. Everything, the house, the collection, the fortune, was to come to her after all, once the nation had taken its tithe for death duties. She would have been one of the richest women in England. And she killed him for it, Hastings said, voice cracking. Killed her own father because she could not wait another month, another week. She killed him because she did not know, Poirot replied. Sir Archibald intended to tell her on her 26th birthday, which fell next month. He had prepared the portrait, the letter, everything. But greed is impatient, and Dr. Hawthorne, who had learned part of the secret from medical papers, convinced her the new will disinherited her entirely. Together they forged the substitution, sold the originals, planned the perfect murder. The serpent box was to be the last forgery, an empty shell into which she would place the curare dart after the deed. But Sir Archibald opened it himself, searching for his daughter's portrait to show her at last, and died caressing the poison meant for a future he would never see. He closed the false bottom with a soft sigh. She murdered the only person who ever truly loved her, and for treasures that were already hers. There is a Greek word, Hastings, nemesis, the goddess who brings retribution exactly proportioned to the crime. She has been busy here. The official photographer arrived then, stamping snow from his boots and setting up his tripod with the cheerful indifference of a man who has seen every variety of human wickedness. Poirot surrendered the serpent box into his keeping, portrait and lock of hair carefully preserved between sheets of tissue. As the magnesium flash powdered the gallery with brief blinding daylight, Poirot turned away. In the hall, the great fire had been allowed to sink into embers. Only a faint warmth remained, and the scent of applewood smoke mingled with the colder smell of snow drifting through the open front door. Poirot paused on the threshold, drawing on his gloves. Come, Hastings. The air is cleaner outside even at 20 degrees of frost. Somewhere a train is running, and London awaits with its honest soot and its reasonable, uncomplicated villains. Hastings followed him down the steps. The snow crunched beneath their shoes like broken glass. Behind them, Siddons Court stood blind and shuttered, its windows already frosting over again, as though the house itself wished to forget what it had witnessed. High above, in the attic nursery, the rocking horse that had moved in the night was still at last. Dust settled upon its painted eyes, and the silence that filled the corridors was no longer the silence of dread, but of something older. The silence of a cradle long empty, of a lullaby no one would ever sing again. Poirot paused at the gate and looked back only once. Some treasures, he said softly, should never be hidden in plain sight. And some secrets once uncovered are better, buried forever. Then he turned up the collar of his overcoat, took Hastings's arm, and together they walked away down the long white drive that led eventually to the world of the living, leaving behind them a house full of jeweled boxes that would gleam in museum cases for centuries, beautiful, brilliant, and utterly, irrevocably empty. Chapter 6. The second serpent weeks later, when the snow had melted into the Cotswolds' gentle hills, and the case of Sir Archibald Christie had been reduced to a slim buff folder in Scotland Yard's archives, closed, solved, and already gathering dust, Hercule Poirot received a parcel at Whitehaven Mansions wrapped in plain brown paper and bearing no return address, only a London postmark and the single word personal typed in uneven capitals that suggested a machine long past its prime. Hastings, who had been dispatched to collect the Morning Post, brought it in with the same wariness he once reserved for unexploded shells on the Somme. Poirot, seated at the breakfast table in a dressing gown of violet silk and an expression of mild irritation at the interruption of his second croissant, turned the parcel over twice. listened to it as though it might tick, then slit the string with a silver fruit knife and unfolded the paper with the reverence usually accorded to papal bulls. Inside lay a second serpent box, smaller than the first, no longer than a man's thumb, carved from a single piece of pale green jade so translucent that light passed through it like water through ice. Its eyes were tiny cabochon rubies, its tongue a needle of gold so fine it seemed impossible that human hands had shaped it. The lid was fastened by a delicate clasp in the form of an apple. A folded note, written in a hand Poirot recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with the February draft, accompanied the gift. Monsieur Poirot, you removed one serpent. Another was always waiting. The game is not finished. F. The ink was fresh, the paper faintly scented with violet cachou, the same scent that had clung to Felicity Blaine's handkerchiefs during the long nights at Siddons Court. Poirot did not touch the box with his bare fingers. Instead, he rang for George, requested a pair of cotton gloves and a magnifying lens, and only then lifted the jade serpent to the light. It was perfect, flawless, and he saw at once, new. The workmanship was unmistakably that of the same hand that had produced the 37 forgeries in Sir Archibald's collection. The microscopic tooling around the scales, the almost imperceptible asymmetry of the left eye that only a master would dare leave as a signature. Felicity Blaine had not worked alone. There had been a teacher, a partner, someone whose skill surpassed even hers. Hastings watched butter congealing on his knife. She's in Holloway awaiting trial. How the devil? She is in Holloway, Poirot agreed. But genius is rarely solitary. Observe the clasp. Press the tiny golden apple with the tip of a pencil. The lid sprang open, revealing not poison, not this time, but a miniature photograph, no larger than a postage stamp, exquisitely hand-colored. It showed a young woman in Edwardian dress, unmistakably the same woman whose portrait had lain hidden beneath the false bottom of the first serpent box. Only here she was older, standing beside a child of perhaps 6 years with pale hair and eyes the color of winter seas. On the reverse, in the same fading sepia ink Sir Archibald had used, someone had written, Elena and Katya, St. Petersburg, 1916. The circle closes. Poirot's breath came out in a small, controlled hiss. Mon Dieu, the grandmother. The Russian émigré was not merely Sir Archibald's mistress. She was Fabergé's last secret pupil, trained in the workshops before the revolution devoured everything. She escaped with her child, our Felicity's mother, and vanished into England. Sir Archibald found them too late. The mother had died of tuberculosis. He took the child, raised her in secret, and taught her nothing of her heritage, but someone else found her first. He set the jade serpent carefully upon the white tablecloth, where it lay like a drop of frozen poison. There is a second serpent, Hastings, and it has been coiled in the dark for 20 years, waiting for its moment. Felicity was the apprentice. The master has been watching, guiding, selling the forgeries through channels we never uncovered. And now the master sends me this, a challenge, a taunt, a promise. Hastings found his voice. You mean the murders aren't finished? I mean they have only begun. The first serpent killed a father, the second will kill, who can say? A nation's heritage, perhaps. Or simply the last witness who can identify the hand behind the forgeries. Poirot rose, suddenly energized, the violet dressing gown swirling like a cape. We go to Holloway this afternoon. Felicity Blaine will talk now. She has nothing left to lose except the truth. And the truth, mon ami, is the only weapon we possess against a serpent that strikes from memory itself. He paused at the door, looking back at the jade box where it lay in a shaft of winter sunlight, the ruby eyes catching fire. One box held a daughter's portrait. This one holds a grandmother's vengeance. Between them lies a trail of blood and enamel that stretches from St. Petersburg to this quiet London morning. Come, Hastings. We have a train to catch, and somewhere in the city a woman, or perhaps a man who signs herself only F, is already choosing the next victim. Outside, a thin sleet had begun to fall, hissing against the windows like 1,000 tiny serpents tasting the air. Poirot drew on his gloves, settled his Homburg at the perfect angle, and stepped into the corridor without looking back. Behind him, the jade serpent lay open upon the breakfast table, the miniature photograph of Elena and Katya, smiling their enigmatic Russian smiles, waiting for the next hand that would dare to close the lid. Chapter 7. The Woman Who Never Was. The visitor's room at Holloway smelled of carbolic, damp wool and despair so thick that it clung to the back of the throat like coal dust. The screw who unlocked the iron gate gave Poirot and Hastings a look that said gentlemen had no business here, then retreated to the far corner where she could pretend not to listen while hearing every syllable. Felicity Blaine was brought in wearing prison grays 2 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled 3 times, her hair cropped short for lice, the winter sea eyes sunken and ringed with violet shadows that made her look 40 instead of 26. The wardress shoved her onto the wooden stool opposite Poirot and chained her left ankle to the ring bolt in the floor with the casual brutality of routine. When the door clanged shut, Felicity did not flinch. She had already learned the language of iron. Poirot waited until the echo died, then laid the jade serpent box upon the scarred table between them. Lid open so the tiny photograph of Elena and Katya faced her like an accusation. Felicity stared at it for a long moment, and something ancient and exhausted moved behind her eyes. "So," she said at last, voice rasping from disuse, "the old woman kept her promise after all." "Explain," Poirot said, gentle as falling snow. Felicity laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "There was never only me. You thought I was the spider, but I was only the web. She taught me everything, how to mix enamel so it ages 20 years in a month, how to forge Peter Carl's very breath. She was there before Sir Archibald ever brought me to Siddons Court. She called herself Mrs. Florence Green, housekeeper to an invalid aunt in the village, but her real name was Countess Yelena Feodorovna Voronina, last living apprentice of Henrik Wigström, the greatest of Fabergé's workmasters. She fled Russia in 19 with my mother in her belly and a suitcase of secrets. My mother died when I was 3. The Countess placed me with cousins, took the name Green, and waited. She waited 18 years for Sir Archibald to claim me, then another 8 to punish him for hiding me like a stain. She leaned forward, the chain rattled. Every forgery I made she designed. Every sale in Geneva she arranged. The curare came from her private cabinet, a souvenir from a lover in Brazil before the war. She told me Sir Archibald planned to give everything to museums, that I would be left with nothing but a secretary's pension. She said blood must answer blood. I believed her. "And the second serpent?" Poirot asked. "Her signature. She always made 2 of everything, one for the client, one for herself. The jade one was meant for the Tsarina's youngest daughter, never delivered. She kept it all those years, waiting for the perfect revenge. When you solved the murder so quickly, she decided the game was too amusing to end. She wants you to chase her now, Monsieur Poirot. She wants you to know how close she is." Felicity's mouth twisted. "She visits me, you know, every Thursday, listed as Cousin Florence Green. The wardresses think her chocolates and clean handkerchiefs are charity. She sits where you sit now and tells me which guard can be bribed, which window in the infirmary has a loose bar. She says when I am hanged she will cut a lock of my hair and set it beside my mother's in the 3rd serpent box, the one no one has found yet." Poirot's voice remained level. "Where is she, mademoiselle?" "Closer than you think." Felicity's gaze flicked to the small grilled window high in the wall. She has rooms in Bloomsbury Gordon Square under the name Madame Voronina now. She no longer hides. She is 73, looks 50, speaks English like a duchess and Russian like a wolf. She has a workshop in the attic where the smell of heated gold and powdered enamel drifts down the stairs all night. She is making something new, something for you. A surprise box, she calls it. When it is finished, she will send it to Whitehaven Mansions exactly as she sent the jade one, and this time the serpent will not be empty. For the first time, Poirot allowed a flicker of genuine anger to cross his face. You will tell me the exact address. 38 Gordon Square, attic flat. But you will be too late. She never stays anywhere longer than a month after she has issued a challenge. By tomorrow she will be gone. Vienna, Paris, perhaps New York. She has passports in 6 names and enough money from the forgeries to live like a princess in exile. She told me the night before you arrested me that the revolution took everything from her except her talent. And talent, she said, is the sharpest revenge. Felicity leaned back, the chain clinking softly. I wanted to be rich. She wanted the world to remember that Fabergé's true heir was never the Bolsheviks who melted the eggs for gold, nor the collectors who locked them behind glass, but a woman who could make the eggs sing again. Sir Archibald's death was only the overture. The wardress rapped on the door. Visiting time was ending. Felicity rose awkwardly, the shackle dragging across the floor. At the threshold, she paused and looked back, and for an instant the secretary's mask slipped entirely, revealing a child who had been monstrously betrayed. Tell her, she said, voice cracking. Tell the Countess that the circle is closed now. Tell her the last serpent should bite its own tail. The door shut. The key turned. Poirot remained seated a long time, staring at the jade box where the tiny photograph smiled its eternal enigmatic smile. That evening, he and Hastings stood in the attic of 38 Gordon Square while constables broke down the door. They found a room still warm from a charcoal brazier, workbenches littered with gold leaf, eggshell porcelain, and pots of enamel in colors that hurt the eye. A half-finished surprise box, an imperial egg of translucent white jade veined with rose gold, rested on a velvet stand, its mechanism complete but its final surprise not yet installed. On the table lay a single sheet of heavy cream paper weighted by a tiny jade serpent no larger than a matchstick. The note, in exquisite copperplate, read, Monsieur Poirot, you are punctual as always. The egg will travel east without me. Look for it in Leningrad where the circle began. One day it will open for you alone. Until then, remember, some treasures are only safe when they remain hidden in plain sight. YFV. Beneath the signature, someone had drawn in fresh vermilion enamel the coiled outline of a serpent devouring its own tail. Poirot folded the paper with finicking care and slipped it into his pocket beside the little pearl-handled revolver that, once again, had not been needed. Outside, a February wind whipped scraps of paper along the empty square. Somewhere far to the east, beyond iron curtains and frozen rivers, a woman with winter in her eyes was already boarding a train, carrying with her the last true Fabergé egg that would ever be made, and the promise of a final perfect crime. Poirot looked up at the darkening London sky and permitted himself the smallest, saddest smile. The game, he murmured, has only changed boards. Chapter 8. The Egg That Never Arrived. Spring 1937 came late and sullen to Leningrad. The Neva still locked in dirty ice when Hercule Poirot stepped off the train from Helsinki with a diplomatic passport that described him as a Belgian numismatist attached to the League of Nations and a heart that beat with the measured fury of a man who has been made to chase a ghost across half of Europe. Hastings had been left behind in London with strict instructions to forward nothing, speak to no one, and feed the canary. Poirot traveled alone, carrying only a small Morocco case containing the jade serpent, the photograph of Elena and Katya, and a letter of introduction from the Belgian ambassador that would open doors the Soviet authorities preferred to keep welded shut. He had not informed Scotland Yard. He had not informed anyone. Some serpents, he had decided, must be faced without witnesses. The city that had once been St. Petersburg wore its new name like a badly fitting uniform. Red banners flapped above the Winter Palace. Loudspeakers barked slogans in Russian and broken German. Queues for bread snaked around corners while black ZIS limousines noshed past them without slowing. Poirot's hotel on the Moika Canal had been the Astoria in another life. Now it was in tourist number 7 and the chandeliers had been sold for tractors. His room overlooked a courtyard where a bronze statue of Lenin pointed eternally toward a future that smelled of boiled cabbage and suspicion. He began with the Hermitage, because that was where the Countess Yelena Feodorovna Voronina would wish the game to end. Among the Fabergé eggs that had survived the revolution only because a far-sighted curator had hidden them in crates labeled agricultural implements. The curator was long dead, but the eggs remained. 9 imperial treasures displayed in a single armored gallery beneath portraits of czars whose faces had been quietly turned to the wall. Poirot spent 3 afternoons there, walking slowly, hands clasped behind his back, studying each egg as though greeting old enemies. The Tsarina's lilac bouquet egg, the coronation egg, the translucent apple blossom egg that had once belonged to the Dowager Empress, all present, all perfect, all waiting for the one that had never arrived. On the 4th day, a woman approached him in the gallery of Dutch masters. She was small, dressed in severe black wool. A red pioneer scarf knotted at her throat, but the eyes beneath the scarf were winter sea green shot through with ice. She spoke French with the pure accent of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. "You are punctual, Monsieur Poirot. My grandmother said you would be." Poirot did not start. He had felt her coming the way one feels weather in the bones. "You are the daughter of Felicity Blaine?" he asked softly. "I am the daughter of no one," she replied. "My mother hanged herself with a stocking 2 weeks ago. The Countess says blood must answer blood, but stockings are quieter than ropes. I am simply the messenger." She placed a small parcel wrapped in oilskin into his gloved hand. "She waited for you here in the city where it began. She wished to see your face when the circle closed." The parcel was heavier than its size warranted. Poirot did not open it in the gallery. Instead, he took a droshky to the Peter and Paul fortress and walked along the frozen river until the wind off the Baltic cut through even his astrakhan collar. There, beneath the fortress walls where so many Romanovs had begun their journey to the next world, he unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was the unfinished egg from Gordon Square, now complete. A sphere of rose quartz so thin it seemed made of dawn light, veined with gold and encrusted with tiny enameled apple blossoms that trembled in the wind as though still alive. At the apex sat a minute serpent, this one carved from a single emerald, its tail and its mouth forming the clasp. Poirot pressed the serpent's head. The egg opened on hinges fine as spider silk. Within, on a bed of black velvet, lay a miniature guillotine no longer than a matchbox, perfect in every detail. The blade polished steel, the lunette padded with crimson silk. And beneath the blade rested a single lock of pale hair tied with blue ribbon. Baby hair the same shade as Felicity's had been. And beside it a second lock, darker, cropped short, still smelling faintly of Holloway's carbolic soap. A scrap of paper in Yelena Feodorovna's copper plate completed the gift. The first egg celebrated birth. The last commemorates death. Between them lies justice. You may keep this one, little Belgian. I have no further use for eggs. The serpent has swallowed its tail. YFV Poirot stood a long time beside the frozen Neva, the wind whipping at his coat, the egg cradled in his palm like a heart torn from a living body. Somewhere in the city, perhaps in a dacha beyond the Narva gate, perhaps already on a freighter bound for Shanghai, the Countess was vanishing again, this time forever. She had delivered her masterpiece and her vengeance in the same breath. There would be no arrest, no trial, no final confrontation beneath chandeliers. She had won by refusing to play the last move. He closed the egg. The emerald serpent gleamed once, coldly, then accepted its own tail again. Poirot slipped it into the inner pocket where the little pearl-handled revolver had once lived. There was no need for weapons now, and walked slowly back toward the city that had eaten its past and was trying, with loudspeakers and 5-year plans, to digest the future. That night he took the train south, changing at Warsaw, again at Vienna, until at last he stood on the platform at Ostend beneath a sky the color of wet pearls. The egg traveled in his Morocco case beside the jade serpent and the photograph of a woman and child who had never truly existed outside of loss. He would never declare it at customs. Some objects are beyond the reach of forms and tariffs. Years later, long after the war had come and gone, long after Leningrad became St. Petersburg again and the imperial eggs returned to public view, visitors to a small private museum in Brussels would sometimes pause before a single rose quartz egg displayed alone in a shaft of northern light. The card read simply, "The apple blossom egg, artist unknown, circa 1937. Children would ask why the tiny emerald serpent was eating its own tail, and the guide would only smile and say it was a symbol of eternity. Only one old man, impeccably dressed, mustache waxed to needle points, would linger longer than the rest. He came every year on the 12th of March, placed a single white camellia beneath the case and stood in silence until the guards began to fidget. Then he would touch 2 fingers to his lips, bow once to the egg, and leave without speaking. No one ever asked his name. They assumed he was simply another mourner paying respects to beauty that had outlived its makers, and in a way they were right. Chapter 9. The Camellia in the Vault. The war came and went like a long fever dream, leaving Europe scarred and Poirot older than any calendar could admit. His mustache had turned the color of cigarette ash. His step required a Malacca cane with a silver greyhound head, yet the eyes remained the same luminous green, bright with the unquenchable vanity of a man who still believed order could be imposed upon chaos if one only arranged the facts with sufficient elegance. In the spring of 1956, he caused a small sensation in Brussels by purchasing, through a discreet lawyer in Geneva, a narrow 18th-century house on the Rue de la Régence, whose cellars had once belonged to the Spanish governors and whose attics smelled of cedar and forgotten treaties. He had the ground floor converted into a private museum, 1 room only, windowless, lit by a single skylight of armored glass. And there, on the 10th anniversary of VE Day, he installed the rose quartz egg upon a pedestal of black marble beneath a bell jar that had once protected Napoleon's campaign maps. No plaque, no catalogue, no opening hours, only a brass plate on the street door that read, in letters so small they might have been an afterthought, H. Poirot, collection privée, entrée sur rendez-vous écrit. He never granted a rendezvous. The house became one of those quiet Brussels legends whispered in the back rooms of Antiquaire. The little Belgian detective who had caught kings and murderers now kept something in his vault that made the Fabergé curators in Leningrad wake sweating in the night. They said it was the lost apple blossom egg. They said it was cursed. They said the old man went down to the vault every evening at sunset alone, and spoke to it in a language no one understood. On the 12th of March 1962, the 52nd anniversary of a birth that had never been officially recorded, Poirot descended the stone stairs for the last time. He wore the violet dressing gown he had favored in the Whitehaven Mansion's days, now threadbare at the cuffs, and carried in his left hand a single white camellia wrapped in tissue. The vault door, a masterpiece by Fichet-Boche, sighed open at the touch of his trembling fingers. The air inside was cool and dry, scented faintly with orris root and the metallic breath of perfection preserved. The egg waited exactly as it had waited for 25 years, the emerald serpent forever swallowing its tail, the tiny guillotine forever poised above two locks of hair that had once belonged to a child and to a woman who had chosen death over disgrace. Poirot placed the camellia in a porcelain vase beside the pedestal. The petals were already browning at the edges. Camellias, he reflected, never lasted long once cut. He studied the egg for a long moment, then did something he had never done before. He lifted the bell jar and set it aside. The rose quartz glowed with its own interior dawn, and the apple blossoms, enameled a quarter-century earlier by a woman who hated him with the pure, perfect hatred of the artist betrayed, seemed to tremble as though a breath had passed across them. He spoke aloud, his voice thin but steady, the French of another century. "Madame la Comtesse, you said the circle would close. You were mistaken. Circles do not close, they merely grow larger until they embrace everything: birth, betrayal, exile, war, forgiveness. Your granddaughter never knew her father loved her. Your great-granddaughter, had she lived, would never have known her mother died, believing herself disinherited. I have kept your eggs safe from museums and millionaires, from commissars and thieves, because some wounds must be allowed to heal in private. Today, I set you free." From the inner pocket of the dressing gown, he drew a small envelope of heavy cream paper, the last sheet remaining from a packet bought in Leningrad in 1937. Upon it, in his own neat, slanting hand, he had written, "To the unknown child born of loss, this egg was made by your ancestor Yelena Feodorovna Voronina, last master of the house of Fabergé. She intended it as vengeance. I return it as restitution. Keep it, sell it, destroy it. Only remember that beauty can be forgiven everything except indifference. H.P." He slipped the envelope beneath the black velvet cushion that supported the egg, replaced the bell jar, and pressed the hidden catch that opened a second, deeper compartment in the pedestal, a compartment no curator would ever find. Into it he lowered the jade serpent, the photograph of Elena and Katya, the two locks of hair now brittle as autumn leaves, and finally the miniature guillotine, its blade catching the light one last time like a tear. The marble slab closed without a sound. Upstairs in the silent house, the telephone had been disconnected years ago. The canary Hastings, once guarded, had died in 1944 during the V-bomb that took half of Bloomsbury. George, the perfect valet, had retired to Eastbourne with a pension and a chest cold. Only the camellia remained, wilting gently in its vase, releasing its faint funereal perfume into air that had not been stirred by human breath since the previous sunset. Poirot climbed the stairs slowly, leaning on the cane. At the top he paused, looked back once toward the vault whose door now stood open like a mouth that had finished speaking, and smiled the small, cat-like smile that had once made murderers tremble. "Bonsoir, mes serpents," he murmured. "Dormez bien." He closed the street door behind him, posted a single letter addressed to the director of the Musée Royal d'Art et d'Histoire, with instructions that the house and its contents were to pass to the Belgian nation upon his death, and walked out into the mild Brussels dusk. A taxi took him to the Gare du Midi. From there a train carried him south through the darkening fields of Flanders toward a small villa in Knokke, where a woman who had once been a duchess's maid now kept a room ready for the only guest she had ever truly loved. 3 days later, the cleaning woman found the house empty, the vault sealed, the camellia brown and fallen. The egg remained exactly where Poirot had left it, glowing softly beneath its crystal dome, waiting for the unknown child who would one day claim the last true Fabergé masterpiece, and with it, the forgiveness that had taken 3 generations and 2 continents to deliver. In the vault, the petals of the camellia dried to paper, curled, and finally crumbled into dust that settled over the bell jar like the gentlest snowfall, covering the rose quartz egg in a lace of forgetting. And there, in the quiet beneath the Rue de la Régence, the serpent slept at last, its tail forever in its mouth, guarding a treasure that had finally, after half a century of blood and exile, become nothing more dangerous than beautiful. Chapter 10. The Egg That Opened in Spring. On the morning of 12th of March 1976, 66 years to the day since a child had been born in secrecy and shame in a St. Petersburg apartment overlooking the Fontanka, a young woman climbed the steps of the narrow house on the Rue de la Régence, carrying nothing but a letter yellowed with age and a name she had never been allowed to speak aloud. She was 24, slight, dressed in the modest coat of a provincial school teacher, and her eyes were the exact winter sea green that had once made 3 generations of men and women pause as though they had seen a ghost. The brass plate still read H. Poirot, Collection Privée, Entrée sur rendez-vous écrit. But the door opened before she could knock because the custodian, an elderly Belgian with a military mustache and the patient sadness of all who guard other people's memories, had been expecting her for 14 years. He led her down the stone stairs without a word. The vault had not changed. The same cool, dry air scented faintly with orris and camellia dust. The same shaft of gray Brussels light falling through the skylight onto the single black marble pedestal. The rose quartz egg waited beneath its bell jar exactly as Poirot had left it, the emerald serpent still swallowing its tail, the enameled apple blossoms still trembling though no wind had ever entered the room. The custodian lifted the jar with the reverence of a priest raising the monstrance, set it aside, and then, because the letter in the young woman's hand bore Poirot's seal and the handwritten instruction à l'enfant inconnu, à ouvrir le 12 mars 1976 ou après, he stepped back and left her alone. She stood a long time, afraid to touch. Her name was Katja, officially Katja Mertens, after the Flemish foster parents who had raised her in Liège with kindness and silence, but the letter she carried, postmarked Knokke 1962 and delivered only after both her foster parents were dead, told her another name, one that belonged to a father who had died before she was born and a mother who had hanged herself in Holloway when Katja was barely 2 months old. The letter was from a lawyer, dry and factual, yet between the lines she had read sorrow and wonder and the promise of something too large to hold. At last she reached out. Her fingers, small, capable, the fingers of a woman who taught piano to children who would never know how famous their teacher might have been, closed around the egg. It was warm, as though it had been waiting for her blood to quicken it. She pressed the emerald serpent's head. The egg opened with a sigh so soft it might have been the house itself exhaling after half a century of held breath. Inside, on the black velvet cushion, lay the envelope Poirot had placed there in 1962, still sealed, the ink only slightly faded. Beside it rested a second, smaller object, a tiny key of white gold shaped like an apple blossom. She opened the envelope with shaking hands. The note was brief, written in the neat, slanting hand she had come to know from photographs and newspaper cuttings. To the child of Felicity and of Archibald, if you read this, the circle has widened enough to hold you. The egg is yours by blood, by talent, and by forgiveness. The key opens the pedestal. Take what you need, leave what you cannot carry. Beauty is heavier than guilt, but lighter than memory. Hercule Poirot, 12 Mars 1962. Tears blurred the words, but she found the hidden catch in the marble, inserted the blossom key, and turned it. The pedestal opened like a jeweler's drawer. Inside lay everything Poirot had buried in 1962. The jade serpent coiled in tissue, the photograph of Elena and Katya, her great-grandmother and grandmother, smiling in pre-revolutionary sunshine. The 2 locks of hair, one pale as moonlight, one darker, cropped short. And the miniature guillotine, its blade dulled now by time and forgiveness. At the bottom rested a final gift, a small leather folder containing share certificates, bearer bonds, and a bank draft drawn on the Credit Suisse in Geneva for an amount that made her sit down suddenly on the stone floor because her knees would no longer hold her. There was one more sheet, a single page torn from a 1937 Leningrad notebook in a different hand, spidery, elegant, the Russian copperplate of a woman who had once signed her work only with a tiny serpent. Little one, I made this egg with hate. He kept it with love. You will carry it with whatever is left. The serpent has swallowed its tail. Now let it sleep. Y.F.V. Katya sat among the ghosts until the custodian gently touched her shoulder and told her the museum would close at 5. She gathered everything, the egg cradled against her heart, the folder tucked inside her coat, the photograph and the locks of hair wrapped in the same tissue that had once held a camellia. The guillotine she left where it was. Some things she understood were better buried forever. Years later, when the house on the Rue de la Régence had become part of the Musée Royal and the vault was open to scholars by appointment only, they found the pedestal drawer empty except for a single white camellia pressed flat between sheets of glass and a note in a woman's careful Flemish hand. The egg has gone home. Thank you for keeping it safe until it could. KM, no one ever discovered where it went. Some said Buenos Aires, others Montreal. A few whispered that it had returned to Russia after the walls came down, bought by a new oligarch who did not know its history and never would. The truth was simpler and more private. It sat on a plain wooden table in a small apartment above a music school in Liège, catching the afternoon light, opening every 12th of March so that children taking piano lessons could watch the apple blossoms tremble and ask why the lady cried when she wound the tiny key that made the nightingale sing. And somewhere in whatever place tidy Belgian detectives go when the little gray cells finally dim, Hercule Poirot allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile. The circle had not merely closed, it had become a cradle.